I'm not going to just go through that through the rest of it, just except to say that this has had a systemic impact on two things: on the government's financial position, and also on Ireland's reputation in the markets. Now, in part, that is self-inflicted. As a small open economy, we're very vulnerable to what's happening in the world. But at a number of levels, these are self-inflicted wounds, the reputational issues that I'm not going to go into. We've done damage. And the effect that that's had can be measured, for example, in the slight downgrading in Ireland's credit rating. It can be measured in what are called the credit default spreads. In other words, what is the probability in the market's view of banks getting into trouble or Ireland getting into trouble, and therefore what is the cost of borrowing to sustain activities? So read it in the market. And yet, you know, there's a very good friend of mine in Westport. I better not say who he is, but his wife's a teacher. He's a bit of a genius. He's just one of these guys who are really good. And he was saying to me years ago, Ray, we have so many tax-driven empty houses. Nobody comes to them except once or twice a year. And he said, we have young fellas who can't buy houses. Well, read it and read. There's the evidence there in front of you. For example, in Connacht, 21% of the housing stock is unoccupied. And that's just one little example of how we have misused our policy instruments. We've made good decisions, we've also made bad decisions. And that also gives us an indication of some of the things that we can do, because in Ireland, we have a big, particularly in the cities, we have big homeless problems. And people who are homeless, it's not a good place to be. And yet this problem of homelessness, talk to the people who are at the front line, and I have talked to some of them, and they will say, why is it that we have 250,000 houses or units or whatever empty, and we can't get people into the street? Now, getting them under cover is not the only answer. You need interventions so that people begin to understand their own gifts. In fact, one of my heroes, Sister Kinsela would say, what a leader. But she would say, hey, you know, it's not enough to get people under a roof, and it's not even enough to love them. They have to be brought to the stage where they can love and accept themselves. But surely be to God, as a rich country, we could do that. And if we haven't done it, why haven't we done it? Because that's part of the diagnosis of the problem. If we don't get this right now, there are problems coming down the line that we are handing on to our children. And they are summarized here in what we call dependency ratios. Now, dependency ratios are quite simple. For example, they would mean looking at the number of people who are over 65 compared with those who are of working age. Those who are over 65, many people are working into the 70s and 80s. I know one guy is working into his 90s, and I know a 92-year-old man who's gone skydiving recently. And they have the photograph to prove it. Okay? So, but the bottom line is that if we want to respect people for the Ireland that they built up, we have to address this problem that's coming down the line. And one of the things that I think almost stands as a metaphor for our failures, all of our failures earlier, is the fact that the National Pension Reserve, which is a very sensible thing to do, was raided. And I use the word raided, not pejoratively. It was taken to safeguard financial institutions. Now, just a word on that before I come back to this. Banks are important. And in banks, there are very many thousands of ethical, hard-working and professional people. What my own research has led me to conclude is this, and I will come back to it. It's not the people, it's the corporate mindset. That's the real problem. It's the business model. It's not, and that's why, for example, you find really good professional healthcare bankers, and they'll be making the phone calls they don't want to make because they know the money is not there. They know the money is not there. And yet the fact that they're not lending has created what I would consider a crisis within a crisis, because there is a huge cash flow crisis among businesses. If you can't get it from the banks, you sweat it from your supplier or your customer. You have to get money in. And that's putting our businesses, our Irish businesses, the businesses that are paying tax and PRSI and giving people dignity at work, that's putting those businesses under ferocious pressure. And that's where I believe the budget was fundamentally misconceived. And the only example I can think of is if you're driving home in the evening and you have a car on yellow, the petrol's running low. Well, you don't cut the petrol hose. And that's really what it did. It took demand out of the economy. It took demand out of business. Through taxation, it took demand and the capacity to keep going. So the budget was, in my view, it was misconceived. It was, and I say if it was an attempt to impress the foreign exchange markets about how tough we really are about making hard fiscal decisions, they were not impressed. And it was the wrong reason to do it. And say if the foreign exchange markets, the people who look at Ireland's fiscal position, are much more likely to be impressed by a country that holds its nerve, that diagnoses the problem, that brings back hope, and does the kind of things I'll talk about in a minute, than one which rolls over and tries to impress people. So, this problem is coming down the line. We have a golden demographic at the moment, which is one of the areas of hope. Our demographic, we have a big labour force, we have a young labour force, we have a labour force that has the capacity to contribute to the knowledge economy. Now ask yourself this question. Are there not projects that need to be done? Are there not community centres that need to be built? Are there not extensions to hospitals that need to be done? Do we not have people capable of doing them? Why are we exporting our JCBs? Why are people capable of contributing? It's counterintuitive in terms of Keynesian economics. It doesn't make sense. And that's why I think we need a new politics. Now, this is important. You'll have to bear with me, Cathy, on this, if you would.
Take all the time you like. This is fascinating.
God bless you. Thank you. Okay. The fallibility of economics, I'm not going to spend time about because economics lost the run of itself compared with science, but I'm not going to. Science is actually quite humble. Scientists are quite humble. They are hypothesis-based. So you produce a hypothesis, Newton produced a hypothesis, and Einstein proves it wrong. Economics purports to deliver certainties like efficient markets, like the assumption of the markets that Dr. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed, the market will correct itself. Well, actually, no, it won't. We can work our way into slumps that continue to lead to a stagnant economy, that continue to destroy lives and companies. That can happen. And economics hasn't quite come to grips with that. But the real point I want to make is this. In terms of diagnosing the problem, you see, it's not really a financial one, and that's why I said earlier, the kind of things I put up earlier, they're the secondary causes. The primary cause, I would simply suggest to you, this is an ethical crisis. This is a crisis about ethics.